Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our October 27, 2023 webinar on how to tell the story of language revitalization and cultural resilience strategies in tribal CCDF programs. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes to let some more folks log in. But in the meantime, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know your name, the tribal lead agency you represent, and your role there. For those who are just joining us, we wanted to thank you for being here today for our October 27, 2023 webinar on how to tell the story of language revitalization and cultural resilience strategies in tribal CCDF programs. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes to allow some more folks to log in. But in the meantime, if you don't mind, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know your name, the tribal lead agency you represent, and your role there. And we'll get started in about just a minute or so. Thank you to everyone sharing in the chat. If you're just joining us for our webinar, we'll get started in about just a minute. But please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know your name, the tribal lead agency you represent, and your role there. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So thank you everyone for joining us today for our October 27th, 2023 webinar on how to tell the story of language revitalization and cultural resilience strategies in tribal CCDF programs. We asked folks who were logging in to share, introduce themselves in the chat. So we'd love to know your name, the tribal lead agency you represent, and your role there. Please feel free to keep introducing yourself as we move on throughout the webinar. Next slide, please. Okay, before we get started, I would like to introduce myself. Diana Gates, Fed, Jerwanaga, Diwa Gatsnune. Hello, my name is Diana Gates, and I am a citizen of the Jerwanaga Nottoway Indian tribe. I'm a senior managing consultant for Mathematica, and I will be moderating this webinar. We are so thankful for all of you who are able to join us today. Now I have a few notes to share about the webinar. We are recording the webinar. We have enabled closed captioning. You can hide captions or adjust the settings with the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. We will post the recording, slides, and transcript online. All participants are muted. And you can type your questions or comments into the chat box at any time. We'd love to hear from you. And we'll have time for questions and a discussion with our panelists at the end of the webinar. And now we would like to launch a poll because we'd like to get to know more about you as well. So we're launching a poll in just a second. There it is. So our poll question is, who is listening to the webinar? You can select one choice. The choices are state and territory state or territory CCDF lead agency staff, tribal CCDF lead agency staff, external researchers, federal staff, TA providers, or other. So if you don't mind responding to that poll, we'd love to know who's joining us today. I think whenever we're ready, we can share the results. Great, thank you. So it looks like we have 2 state or territory CCDF lead agency staff. We have 7 tribal CCDF lead agency staff, 3 external researchers, 6 federal staff, 11 TA providers, and 7 who chose other. So if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, we'd love to hear more about you as well. We can go ahead and close that poll and move on to the next slide, where I will turn it over to Matty.
This webinar is an activity of the Child Care Research and Evaluation Capacity Building Center. The center is supported through the Office of Planning, Research and Evaluation, OPRE, in the Administration for Children and Families, and managed through a contract with the Urban Institute in partnership with Mathematica. Our OPRE project officer is Alicia Blandon, and our project director is Teresa Derrick Mills. I am the project manager, Matty Mackenzie-Liu, and am joined behind the scenes today by Jacqueline Chambers and Isaac Bledsoe. The goal of the center is to assess and build the research and evaluation capacity of Child Care Development Fund CCDF lead agencies. To learn more, please see our Building Child Care Research Capacity webpage. Isaac will put a link in the chat. Diana Gates at our partner organization Mathematica will be facilitating the webinar today. I will turn it back over to her. Thank you.
Nyawit, thank you, Matty. We can go to the next slide. The case for telling our stories is strong, significant, and critical. So I'd like to open the webinar with a grounding quote from Dr. Christine Sims, who is Acoma Pueblo and director of the American Indian Language Policy Research and Teacher Training Center at the University of New Mexico. She says, "This is a critical generation of Native children, the last to prevent the deterioration of our native languages. Without language, how long can a culture survive without unraveling? We need a different paradigm to win this race against time." We know many of you here today are interested in or are already working on language or cultural revitalization efforts in your community. As Native people, we have always known the unique role education plays in cultural and language instruction, especially in the younger years. So early childhood education is the perfect place to infuse culture and language revitalization into programming. Some of you may also be wondering, how do I know that these efforts are making a real difference in my community? What research or evaluation practices can our program do to better understand the work we're doing with our young ones? How can we gather data to tell that story to our community and beyond? And so we hope this webinar is helpful and encouraging to you as you create measures that truly take into account culture and context and gather data that can help support your existing or future efforts. In this webinar, speakers will share steps that tribes have taken in their work to bring new life to their languages and share them more widely. We'll also share national and state level research and tools and methods to gather data. And then at the end, we will also have a tribal CCDF administrator who will share ways that, that their community has carried out some of this research in their efforts to bring new life to their language and build resilience in their culture. Next slide. All right, next up, we have speaker introductions. Our first speaker is Melody Redbird Post. Dr. Redbird Post is the project director of the Tribal Child Care Capacity Building Center, a technical assistance service sponsored by the Office of Child Care. She will give us a grounding overview of current language and cultural revitalization efforts in tribal early childhood education. Our next speaker is Jessica Barnes-Nager, Director for Community Partnerships, Office for Public Engagement and Scholarship at Michigan State University, and co-principal investigator of the Tribal Early Childhood Research Center, supported by the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. Dr. Barnes-Nager's presentation will be about moving toward Indigenous-based measurement. Then we will have additional insights from our guests. In a moderated question and answer panel, Dr. Redbird Post and Dr. Barnes-Nager will be joined by Carolyn Codapony, the Tribal CCDF Administrator for Comanche Nation. Ms. Codapony will share with us insights from her community's work toward measuring language and cultural revitalization efforts. It's great to have all of you on the webinar, and we do encourage you to share your questions and comments throughout the webinar, as we'll hopefully have time to answer some of them at the end. And I will now turn it over to Dr. Redbird Post. And Dr. Redbird Post may not be able to be on webcam, but she will be presenting by audio.
De onde batsan. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so excited to share with all of you today some information related to language and cultural revitalization in tribal early childhood education. Next slide. To start with, there are about 197 indigenous languages that are still spoken on Turtle Island or North America today. 135 of those languages are categorized as endangered languages and spoken only by elders. Next slide. So what is language revitalization? What do we mean by that? So for the purpose of this webinar, language revitalization is defined as an intentional effort by a tribal nation or a tribal community to restore intergenerational transmission of their language. Next slide. So in thinking about priorities to support language and culture in Tribal Child Care and Development Fund or CCDF programs, recently, tribal lead agencies submitted their fiscal year 2023 to 2025 tribal CCDF plans to receive CCDF funding from the Office of Child Care over the next 3 years. Out of the 217 tribal lead agencies who submitted their tribal CCDF plans in January of 2023, there were 97% of those who indicated that they are planning to conduct culturally relevant activities as part of their CCDF quality improvement funding initiatives. And then, out of those who indicated culturally relevant activities, 77% of those tribal lead agencies indicated they are incorporating tribal language in childcare settings. And then, out of those, 64% are implementing culturally based training for families and tribal childcare providers. Next slide. So a little bit more on some priorities to support language and culture in tribal CCDF. So there were 59% of tribal lead agencies who are planning on training on implementing tribal language and culture in their classroom settings. And then 55% indicated that they are partnering with tribal language and culture departments to develop curricula. And then we have 20% of tribal lead agencies who indicated they are implementing language immersion classrooms or language nests using their tribal CCDF quality funds. Next slide. So let's think about some recent research on language and culture as resiliency. Researchers have found that more recent understandings of the importance of supporting native language development in the early years and the role of early childhood education in this process have led to a shift towards supporting early childhood programs as allies in native language revitalization efforts. Next slide. Next, on language and culture as resiliency, Researchers have found that home and center-based early childhood education and care programs such as home visiting, Head Start, and childcare can support the inclusion of native language and culture in the program's home-to-school connection efforts. These programs are in a unique position to get to know families and build upon families' specific cultural strengths. And for reference, see Sarche et al. 2020. Next slide. Then within tribal language and culture as resiliency, focusing on cultural strengths has the potential to build trust and provide opportunities for collaboration between families and program staff to support young children's engagement with native language and cultural practices. Next slide. Finally, research on tribal language and culture as resiliency has found that connecting American Indian and Alaska Native children and families with their native language and cultural practices supports a worldview that promotes cognitive, physical, and emotional well-being for children, their families, and the staff working in AIAN communities. Next slide. Let's talk about the benefits to children when they participate in tribal language and culture revitalization efforts as part of tribal early childhood programs. So first, tribal language and culture revitalization can have a positive impact on children's comprehension and productive and receptive language skills. It gives them opportunities to learn cultural values, norms, and practices. It builds positive self-esteem, improved student behavior, and we also see higher test scores on English-only tests after only 1 year in a tribal immersion program. Next slide. Let's talk about some benefits to tribal childcare providers. So when tribal childcare providers participate in tribal language and culture revitalization efforts, we see improved student and teacher retention, increased family participation, language revitalization through building a community of speakers. It also offers community-based opportunities for children to speak their target language outside the classroom setting, and high-quality immersion programs are grounded in the communities they serve. Next slide. So when designing language learning experiences in tribal early childhood programs, there are many different teaching approaches. Some common ones are total physical response, action learning, and teaching through the language. And children also have the opportunity to infuse traditional tribal knowledge within their language learning experiences. And childcare providers can also incorporate their own Indigenous ways of learning throughout their lesson plans and experiences. And they can also develop their own culturally revitalizing curriculum that is also grounded in their tribal ways of knowing. Next slide. One resource that can help teachers and programs get started in designing language learning experiences is this resource from the Office of Head Start found on the Early Childhood Learning and Knowledge Center website. This is the Making It Work, Implementing Cultural Learning Experiences in American Indian and Alaska Native Early Learning Settings for Children ages birth to 5. This toolkit supports tribal and American Indian and Alaska Native and early childhood programs to incorporate their tribal language and culture into their lesson planning and curricula. And early childhood programs who can use this toolkit include Tribal Head Start, Early Head Start, Tribal Childcare, and even Tribal Home Visiting. And we put the link in the chat box for you to reference. This toolkit was piloted by 7 tribal nations who participated participated in the pilot project for launching and preparing this toolkit. All right, next slide. Another resource is the Language Nest Handbook from the First Peoples Cultural Council, and we'll also put this in the chat box as well for your reference. Next slide. For information on recent research that could help inform your program's efforts is this resource on tribal language and culture, the Home and Community, Native Language and Cultural Experiences Among AIAN Children in Region 11 Head Start. Findings from the American Indian and Alaska Native Head Start Family and Child Experiences Survey 2015. And we put that link in the chat. Next slide. Another resource is a national webinar from 2018 on celebrating tribal early childhood language revitalization efforts across the United States. From the Administration for Children and Families, we have a webinar recording and a link to the slides also available online. Next. There's another resource. This is a paper that was compiled, a research review called Language Documentation, Revitalization, and Reclamation, Supporting Young Learners and Their Communities from the Child Language Research and Revitalization Working Group, also available online. Next slide. And then finally, here is a resource, the Report on Tribal Language Revitalization in Head Start and Early Head Start provides some great insights on how to get started with incorporating tribal language and culture revitalization efforts into your tribal early childhood programs and settings. And with that, I will turn it back over to Diana. Aho de bata.
Thank you, Dr. Redbird Post, so much for all of your insights. And now we would like to shift into connecting program to research. We would love for you to answer this question in the chat. Have you tried to measure whether language or cultural revitalization efforts are making a difference in your community? And if the answer is yes, if you would like to briefly describe your efforts, that would be amazing as well. While we wait for some more answers to come in, I thought I would read the question again, and we'd love for you to provide your answer in the chat. Have you tried to measure whether language or cultural revitalization efforts are making a difference in your community? It looks like we're getting a few answers in that folks have not begun to measure their efforts. We also have some answers of yes and would like more input on the subject. Some say not sure where to gather data as children age through the public school systems. These are all really helpful context for us as we move forward in our presentation. And then some of these, if you have questions related to some of these at the end, we'd love to hear your questions as well in our moderated panel. So thank you all for sharing your answers to these questions. We can move to the next slide, where I will turn it over to Dr. Barnes-Nager.
Hi, everybody. It's so good to be with you all. It's interesting to see the mix of people who have attempted to do some evaluation work and those or measurement work and those who haven't had that experience yet. So hopefully this will be supportive of all of you, depending on no matter where you are in your experience. So what I'm going to talk about is how we can move toward Indigenous-based measurement as we're talking about Native language revitalization efforts and inclusion of culture in our early childhood programs in our classrooms. It really is an important process to consider how our measurement approaches, strategies, and tools align with the cultural context in our communities. And so I like to talk about this as one step at a time because these very small, sometimes incremental steps, and I hope I can show this to you throughout our time together, each of those small incremental steps really does make a difference. Okay, next slide, please. I went to hit the slide button. I'm not moving the slides. Okay, so first I want to talk about cultural continuum of measurement. So I just said that it's important that we consider how our measurement processes and tools align with the cultural context of our communities. And this is actually an adaptation of a cultural continuum of alignment that actually came first out of practice-based area. So cultural continuum of alignment for prevention and intervention strategies. And so those of us doing work in research, in the research space and evaluation space, really wanted to develop a more kind of structure for how we talk about cultural alignment in our measurement. And so and I'll describe each of these in more depth as we go through the presentation, including examples of measures that fit in each of these categories. So that first category is non-adapted. The second category, surface structure alignment. The third category, deep structure alignment. And the fourth category is culturally grounded. Next slide, please. Now, these are the aspects of measurement that we consider when we're talking about or trying to identify if our measurement processes and tools are culturally aligned. So we're looking at things like the language and images present. We're looking at the concepts that underlie our measures. We're looking at the constructs we're actually attempting to measure and how we operationalize them or operationalizations. And we're also looking at our measurement approach or our approaches to measurement. Next slide, please. So this looks like a lot right now, but we're actually going to break this down step by step. So what we have here in this table along the very top is all we're going to consider right now. At the very top, we are looking at what we are examining. Our columns include the categories of alignment. So here are those 4 boxes that I just read off to you a couple of slides ago. Non-adapted, which is another way of saying generic alignment, surface structure alignment, our deep structure alignment, and then culturally grounded alignment. Now, next slide, please. On this next slide, here we see our rows. These are the measure elements. That's the slide immediately after the slide where I introduced the 4 categories. These are the elements of our measures that we consider. Again, language and images, concepts, constructs, operationalizations, and our measurement approaches. Next slide, please. So now we're going to look at what it means to be non-adapted, or what it means to have this kind of very generic alignment. So here, our languages and images are low to mid, and I want to note here that these are ranges because there's no exact precise, it's a low for sure, or it has to be a low. Again, these are kind of fluid categories, and we want to have more porous boundaries than very kind of tight rigid structure around these. So in these non-adapted measures, they tend to be low to mid in alignments for the language and images that are used. They tend to be low to mid in the concepts that are underlying the measures. They tend to be low to mid in the constructs that are being measured and how they are operationalized as well. And then those measurement approaches could be low to high. I'll explain that when we get into our example. Okay, next slide, please. So then in our surface structure alignment here we have our language and images often in surface structure alignment tend to be high. It's one of the easiest things we can do. Change the images in our measures, change the language we're using in our measures. But often when we see the surface structure alignment, the underlying constructs in the measure that we're using or concepts in our measure and our constructs and operationalizations tend to stay in that low to mid range. So even though we've changed how it looks, we're not changing the underlying structure of the measure and of what we are actually measuring from that. The measurement approaches could also be low to high in surface structure alignment. Okay, next slide, please. So now for deep structure alignment. In deep structure alignment, here we tend to have high for our language and images, the concepts, constructs, and operationalizations. So we've not only changed the images and language that we're using, also changed that underlying structure of the measure. Often in deep structure alignment, what we don't have, what's not in the high range, is our approach to measurement. So how we're actually gathering the information. I think this will be more clear when we do the example.
For deep structure alignment, measurement approaches are low to mid.
Okay, next slide, please. Now in culturally grounded alignment. In culturally grounded alignment, everything is high. From language and images, concepts, constructs, operationalizations, and our measurement approach also aligns with what we see in the underlying structure. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to give examples of each. So hopefully all that explanation of that big table hopefully will make a little more sense now. So next slide, please. So for our non-adapted or surface structure alignment, we're going to take a look at the class. How many of you put in the chat if you've heard of the classroom assessment scoring system? Let's see how many of you have had yes. Probably lots of yeses, right? Okay, yes. So many people either in childcare or Head Start. I see some people who are certified as coders in the class, infant and toddler version or preschool version. Yep. So you all are familiar with what you're seeing here. The class measures 3 broad domains of the quality of interactions that are occurring in the classroom: emotional support, classroom organization, and instructional support. And in each of those 3 broad domains, we have these dimensions that are actually what we are measuring.
In emotional support, we're measuring positive climate, negative climate, educator sensitivity, and regard for child perspectives.
And we're all in classroom organization, we're measuring behavior management, productivity, instructional learning formats, and in instructional support, we're measuring concept development, quality of feedback, and language modeling. And so that's what we're actually measuring here. I have here that this is the 2nd edition version of the class. And actually, if we look at measurements in cultural alignment of the class, we do see differences between the original class and the 2nd edition version of the class. Okay, next slide, please. So here we have the table, and here is my review of the class regarding alignment and why it fits in this non-adapted or generic alignment. We definitely see that the language and images are low, very little cultural alignment, and this is for many, not just one of the Indigenous communities or tribal communities that we work with. But we work with many communities, and this is what we tend to see across. So low on those language and images, low on the general concept that underlies the instrument, low on the constructs that we're actually measuring. So those dimensions is what we would call those constructs. Those operationalizations, though, range from low to mid. Some of those operationalizations, particularly as they've shifted their language in the how each dimension is defined, particularly as we drill down to the behavioral marker levels, we do see differences from first edition to the second edition, where some of those operationalizations move from that low range maybe to the mid range. Okay, so for example, in the original version of the class, eye contact was a behavioral marker for respect. And in some of our communities, that may work. And in other communities, eye contact is not a sign of respect. In fact, it's a signal of challenging authority. Okay? So in that case, that would be very low, right? It's low cultural alignment for that operationalization. And the measurement approach here really ranges from low to high. It depends on who's doing it and how they are using that instrument. Someone coming in from outside of the community who's not familiar with the cultural context, who doesn't know the language, if native language is spoken in the classroom, it's very low alignment, right? But someone who is for you all who are certified in your programs, part of your community, if you are using it and you are using it in a way that you know is appropriate in your community, let's just say in your community it's inappropriate to do those kinds of observations during meal times, and so maybe you don't do them during meal times, then that measurement approach could be high. So it really depends on who's doing it and how that's being done. Okay, so that's non-adaptive generic alignment. Most of the measures that we have are in this category. Vast majority of the measures that we have are in this category. There's nothing wrong inherently with the measures in this category, but we need to understand the implications of using these measures. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so on to surface structure alignment. Next slide. So here we're going to look at a school readiness assessment measure that identifies many aspects of school readiness. Here's an original page. It was a page where children learned to identify the colors, color identification.
The slide shows an image of 6 lollipops, each of which is a different color.
Next slide, please. If you change that measure to now look like this.
The slide now shows a similar image, but the lollipops are now replaced with 6 feathers, each of which is a different color.
Right, where you're still allowing children to identify colors, but you're changing the image, right? Here we have surface structure alignment. So next slide, please. Here's a page where we see cats, a mother cat and kittens who are in a room. It's a very empty room and children are supposed to describe the picture, and that's a part of the measure. So next slide, please. Here we see a revised version of this.
The slide now shows a mother coyote and baby coyotes depicted in a desert landscape.
We still see an adult animal and baby animals in a context that maybe is more appropriate for children in a certain community, and they still would have the opportunity to describe this picture. All right, next slide, please. So for this particular example of the school readiness assessment, I think you can see why it's surface structure alignment. Language and images have been changed to be high, but those underlying concepts, constructs, and how we operationalize what it is that we're measuring are all still low. And our measurement approach could be low to mid, but it's never going to be high because we are sitting down and testing in a very not kind of authentic way for the children, right? Again, there's nothing wrong with that. It is what it is, but we just want to recognize what that means for our measurement approach. Okay, next slide, please. All right, now for deep structure alignment, we're going to look at an example from the native culture and language in the classroom observation. There are 3 versions of this. Each version aligns differently on the cultural continuum. Next slide, please. This one is in the deep structure. So here we have culturally relevant objects. I'm not going to read all of these from this list, but it includes objects like cultural books, native language labels, native music and instruments, all the way down to items such as outside spaces or objects, subsistence tools, or representations.
The slide shows a list of culturally relevant objects, including cultural books, native language labels, native music and instruments, natural objects, toys representing animals, native architecture, native dress or regalia, native foods, representations of spiritual or traditional ways of life, native art, outside spaces and or objects, and subsistence tools or representations.
Next slide, please. And then we have native language use, categories of native language use items. In 2015 and 2019, the first 2 versions of the instrument, all data were categorized within formal and informal use. However, in 2023, from feedback from community partners, that was changed to include types of interactions that can include native language use, who participated in those interactions, and how children responded to those interactions. That really changes the instrument.
The slide shows the correct year, 2022, during which changes to the instrument were completed.
Next slide, please. We also included in the new version culturally relevant activities like traditional storytelling, lessons and teachings about traditional values, ceremonies, cultural practices, traditional food practices, and traditional music and dance. Next slide, please. Now, in the data collection methodology section, it really matters, again, as it does with the class, who's administering this. So if a person is observing and looking at this, someone from outside of the community, that's going to be a very different type of approach to how you're using this method as compared to if a person who's a part of the community is gathering that observation information. Next slide, please. So for deep structure alignment, for this example, we see high for language and images, concepts, constructs, and operationalizations. That measurement approach is low to mid. Low if you have someone from outside the community conducting this observation, mid if you have someone from inside the community conducting this observation. It's not high simply because we're using more of a checklist with this, right? And we know that that doesn't really represent the richness that our communities really exhibit in how native language and cultural experiences happen in the classroom. Next slide, please. So now we're going to look at culturally grounded alignment, and we're going to look at the culturally immersed classroom interactions observation for this. Next slide, please. And here we're going to look at a tool that a group of us developed that is called the Culturally Immersed Classroom Interactions Observation. And we look at cycles of observation, reflection, and action, collaboration, nonverbal exchanges, autonomy in routines, autonomy in problem solving, and co-regulation. Next slide, please. The data collection methodology is important here because it relates to what we're talking about, how it's aligned. We're looking at when people are using this instrument, they are noting the time that they see something occur. And this is through video review. So you videotape what's happening in your classroom, and then you watch that video. You note the time you see something occur. Let's just say it's a cycle of observation, reflection, and action. And you note the frequency at the end. You can look at the frequency that you saw certain types of interactions occur. And then also you can do a qualitative review of that. It's only designed to be used by a person who's a part of the community. Next slide, please. And so here we see it's high across all.
The slide shows high alignment for all categories, including language and images, concepts, constructs, operationalizations, and measurement approaches.
Our measurement approach allows for both that quantitative, we're gathering some numbers on how many times we see things occur, but we're also able to look at those qualitative reflections, the stories that come from those observations as well. Next slide, please. What really matters is that we find the right balance in our measures. We may need to use some measures that are not at all culturally aligned because they tell us something important about what's happening in our program, but particularly when we're looking at how we can support our native language revitalization efforts and inclusion of culture in our classrooms, and how that's important for our communities. And in those evaluation efforts, we really do need to find that right balance and find measures that are culturally aligned. So I know I went over time, I apologize, but thanks so much, and I'll turn it over. Nice to be with you all.
Thank you, Dr. Barnes-Danger, so much for all of your insights. We are so appreciative of everything that you have shared with us today. And I'm hoping as well we could please have Dr. Redbird Post and Ms. Cotaponi join us for this section on insights from our guests. And while our panelists return to the screen, we welcome your questions for the panel. To ask a question, please type it into the chat box, and we will return to participant questions at the end. Wait, while we're all back up here. Okay. So I'll start by asking a question of each of our panelists. And then, of course, during that time, we welcome your questions for the panel while they're answering this first round. That way, it'll give you a chance to think and reflect. We welcome all of your questions, reflections, and comments. So Carolyn, this is your first time joining us in our webinar for today. So I would love if you could introduce yourself for everyone who is participating.
Medewika, Nananiatsa, Carolyn Cotaponi, BC Nadama Naitana, Nananamanatsa, Cotaponina Desa Taranepana. Hello, everyone. I'm coming to you from Lawton, Oklahoma, but I actually live in Cache, Oklahoma, way down here in Southwest Oklahoma, and I'm happy to be with you today. I just mentioned my families that I come from the Cotaponi and the Tatanepper family. I am a Namawaipa, a Comanche woman. I am also of Kiowa descent. So I'm real happy to be here today.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. All right, our first question for the panel is for you. Can you give us a brief overview of the origins of your tribal CCDF program's desire to gather data about your language revitalization work?
I've been pondering over that a lot today. I just want everyone to know that I have been doing language work in my community for, I want to say 21 or 22 years now. And so it's been a lot of work over the years. But basically, when I became, I started working with the Comanche Nation child care programs back in 2002 and became the director in 2003. We began as an initiative from an A&A grant. It was kind of a social programs grant, and it established the Early Childhood Development Center for the Comanche Nation. And we were not under tribal government. We proposed later in 2006 to come under the Child Care Development Fund program. And so even though we're kind of old, 20 plus years, we have been a tribal CCDF program for about 17 years now. Well, I had just moved back into the community, and I had lived out of the community for close to 30 years when I came back. My grandmother was a speaker. When I grew up in this community, there were I heard Comanche every day on the streets, everywhere in the stores. I heard it, and that's what inspired me to continue this work. And so when I came back, I had to really look around and evaluate the community language efforts at that time. And I had to look around and say, okay, hey, what's going on here? Because I wanted to, my grandmother was still alive, but she had Alzheimer's, and she was still in the community, but she was ill. And so I started trying to learn my language, and I decided everything coincided at that time. We found out that it took a lot of realization of what needed to be done, and I wanted to be a part of it. And so when I became the director, it was very evident that the community wanted language to be incorporated and to be used in the early childhood development centers. And so we have always been committed to it. And the work predominantly that I've done over the past 20 years has been in building capacity to create new speakers and to create new Comanche language teachers. And so it's taken about 20 years of a lot of hard work partnering and being a part of initiatives, surveys, research, and a lot of work has gone on. I could talk forever about it, but it's a lot. I hope that kind of is a good overview for you.
Yeah, thank you, Carolyn. I have a follow-up question for you. I know that there are some people in the room with us today who have not begun a process of gathering data about their efforts. Would you mind sharing a little bit more about how you got started in the process, or different steps you may have taken to gather data?
Sure. We are very fortunate that we have a nonprofit that was established 32 years ago. And so it had already been in existence when I came, and it's called the Comanche Language and Cultural Preservation Committee. And they are a 501(c) here in Oklahoma, and they established a nonprofit for the work that they did. And the main work that they had done was preservation at that time. And then it's moved over to reclamation at this time, but there's a lot of bumps in the road. And I think the main thing is just to become a participant, become involved, become an advocate, because I consider myself a strong advocate, not only for the Comanche language, but for all Indigenous languages. And so trying to just see and talk to people, but if you're involved, then you develop the trust. And if your presence is there and that they see that you care and you're committed and dedicating into helping the efforts, then a lot of things will happen where you'll become trustworthy, you'll become an active role player, you'll be able to obtain materials, and also be successful in moving the work forward. Also a good partner.
Thank you so much for sharing. My next question will be for Dr. Barnes-Nager. So we know starting an evaluation process can feel really daunting. And in your work with other tribal early childhood programs, do you have any tips or considerations to share on how to get that process started?
Yeah, it can be really daunting. And I think that, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, we want to think about this as a step-by-step process. So start small, start thinking of a good question that you want to answer, a question that's specific enough to be able to answer, but not so specific that you end up with just too tightly of a bound question that you're answering, an answer that's going to be useful. And so that's what you want to do, is really focus on that first question that you want to begin to explore. This will point you to what kinds of approaches you want in your evaluation process. because your approach is really going to depend on the question that you ask. There are a lot of different supports out there for programs. So I encourage you to look out for supports. I have a couple of links that I'll add into the chat too.
Great, thank you so much for sharing. And I think we had a clarifying question earlier during your presentation. I thought I might ask it now while we're in this section. So one of the participants said, when you say that a person has to be a part of the community, what exactly does that mean if I'm a Native person who is not from a community working in another community?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I was working on typing an answer, but it was very long because it's not a quick question to answer, but it's a great question. What really matters is that the person who's using that instrument understands the cultural context in which they are in. So for someone from, say, a Michigan tribe to go down to New Mexico and use an instrument in one of the pueblos in New Mexico, that wouldn't really work, right? They may be a Native person, but they're not familiar with that cultural context. They really shouldn't be using that instrument. Yeah, I saw that little laughing emoji. It's kind of funny when you think about it, right? Like our what's so beautiful about culture is it's so tied to the land that we live on in our context. And so that's what's really important. We also have communities who have program staff who've been working in their communities for 25 years, who are not Native, who are not members of that tribe, but they trust to use these measures because they've been embedded in their community for so long. They feel that they do understand that context. So we ask programs to really consider who's in the best position to understand the cultural context and who understands early childhood. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, please feel free to keep asking questions in the chat. In the meantime, Ms. Kodaponi, I'm going to turn back to you to ask you another question. So I know that you and we've had some conversations outside of this around innovations and early childhood programming, and that being innovative is accepting the idea that things, just because things have always been done this way doesn't mean that we have to continue to do this way.
Mhm.
And so oh, sorry.
I said, yeah, huh?
Yeah. And so I was thinking about this when you were speaking earlier that, in this process, did you come up against any of that? How have you had conversations around conducting surveys or any of that? I just wondered if there was a tie-in for you with your experience with this process.
I've learned a lot because I've been doing it a lot, and even as recently as this year, I've learned a lot of negative stuff as well, such as lateral violence. But it's just, I just continue to go back to doing the right thing. I have questioned Creator many times and going like, is this even important to you? And every time I hear from God that yes, this is, and I know it makes our children better and stronger. But my pet peeve is people saying, well, we've always done it this way. I mean, you hear it a lot in just your regular job, not even in language work, but I've heard it over the years that, well, it's always been this way, done this way. Because being innovative for me means not accepting that, and to do the work. And I've been fortunate to be in the Tribal Child Care Leadership Program, the PLLM, where I worked with you, Diana. And I've also, as a jumping board off of that, I'm involved with the World Forum, and I have a voice in the Indigenous Peoples Action Group, where I work with Indigenous people from all over the world. And I continue to do that work with them because it's inspiring, because this work is hard, and it's not for the weak in faith at all, because it's a very important, and it's not for like now, it's for like people we won't even know. And it always touches my heart when I talk about that, because that's what I think of. My great greats and those kids, it's going to make them better. And the stuff that we're trying to reclaim now is so hard, but it's well worth the efforts to do it. And I just want to say one more thing, that working with the World Forum, I learned that I found my voice through them, being through a global leader for young children, that one person's voice can affect thousands. And it's really inspired me with the World Forum Foundation, because I can see one person get up and tell what they've done. And it's affected thousands of children. And so I just want to encourage everyone, because I know it's hard. It's really hard work, but it's so very worth it. And I didn't mean to cry. I didn't think I was going to cry on this webinar. The World Forum folks see me cry all the time, but it's really something I'm very passionate about for our children.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing. I don't know if you see all the hearts on the screen are sending you their support, and I'm sure they feel similarly to you as well. It's impossible to separate the personal from the professional when you're in this work, and we show up and we bring our whole selves to this work, and that's something that I think we honor and we ask for others to honor as well. So I appreciate everything that you have said so much. And it's okay to cry. It's definitely okay to do that. Okay, let's see. So I don't know if we've had another question from our participants yet, but please feel free to keep adding questions in. Jessica, I do have another question for you in the meantime. And so I think we've seen some questions, and I've seen some chat with you with sharing specific resources, and thank you so much for sharing all of that. So my question for you is, what are some research methods or measures that have been used to examine language revitalization and cultural resilience strategies? What can we share in addition to everything we've already shared today?
Yeah, well, I think you quoted Dr. Christine Sims at the beginning of this presentation. She's done a lot of amazing work in that area as well. And I'm so honored that I've gotten to work with her over the years. And actually, she's a part of the team who co-developed the measure that we talked about at the end, as well as revising the Native culture and language in the classroom observation. There are pieces within those measures that could be useful. And so, again, you would need to look at those measures yourself. We always advise people to change things. If something doesn't work for you, if something is different in your community, then change it. Because research questions related to language revitalization and cultural resilience strategies are always going to be best answered using localized data collection strategies. Data that, again, I talked about how important the cultural context is, how important land is, how important what's around us is a part of that. And so we can't answer it using measures that are devoid of any of that, right? So we have to allow for locally based data collection processes. We have to support developing measures that are specific for your community. And I think we can take existing measures and develop kind of broad structures that allow for localization at that behavioral marker level. And so I think that this is how we can gather information in a way that allows us to get useful information about Native language and cultural approaches in early learning.
Thank you. Carolyn, I saw you give a thumbs up. I didn't know if you wanted to add anything or if you were just agreeing.
That was someone actually telling me they're leaving for the day.
Oh,
No, but I mean, as far as like, one thing I wanted to say too is that the expertise like Dr. Barnes has, that stuff is needed in Indian country with language revitalization programs, because that's one thing that my tribe never wanted to bring in anyone on the outside, but we talked them into, like, there's language revitalization efforts had moved so much and we were getting left behind, where we may have been at the forefront 32 years ago in doing things with a nonprofit before I moved back into my community. But then it got to the point where we're going, hey man, we're getting left. And it's because we didn't have the expertise in our community. And so we had to talk our elders that created the nonprofit, who like they're in their 80s and 90s now. And we had to tell them, you know, we need to bring outside people who are experts and hire them as consultants and help them to do the work. And like I said, I did a lot of work on building capacity. And so, but you have to walk before you can run, and there's so much expertise now in the field that's going to be my second career moving forward, that I want to become a second language teacher, and I can become a teacher till I'm no longer here on this earth, because it's a lifelong process. And that's what people in the community don't understand, the hard work, and they don't understand the daily commitment and hours of studying to become a second language learner. But once we build these with expertise and consultants and with people who are passionate and dedicated, then we can create second language speakers from our infants that we take care of.
Yeah, definitely agree. Thank you so much for sharing that. I see we have another question in the chat. So this question asks, do you see a role for descriptive data that describes the process of becoming a language immersion center and ways programs are doing this? So I think sort of documenting the processes it takes.
Yeah, Melody actually shared a report. One of the reports that Melody shared was from AAN Faces. And a group of us took descriptive data from AAN Faces, American Indian Alaska Native Family and Child Experiences Survey. It's a really long acronym. But those were descriptive data, but they were a group of us with some researchers and community partners got together and described those data, right? So we took the descriptive data and added story and context to those descriptive data. And it's become a really powerful way to talk about why and how the inclusion of Native language and culture is occurring both in the classroom and outside of the classroom. So yes, I think it's a really important part of that process. And then adding story to those descriptive data is particularly powerful.
Thank you. All right, I think we're coming a little close to the end of our webinar. So I wanted to ask, before we wrap up, do either of you have any final reflections that you'd like to share?
I would just like to say thank you to everyone that's committed their time and efforts to language revitalization. It has been rewarding. It is something that you'll never be sad or sorry for doing. And just think of all those thousands of children that you're affecting that aren't even here yet. I just want to encourage everyone, because it's a very important. And also I want to give a shout out to my program. And I'm the leader. I've been the leader for a long time, but whenever I go on to my next career, I hope that they continue the efforts that we have started the past 20 years.
Thank you.
Hard to follow you because you're always so amazing. I definitely want to thank, I'm so thankful for all the programs that I've been able to work with, because I feel like this work wouldn't be where it is, not feel like, it definitely wouldn't be where it is if it weren't for all of the programs who also feel so passionately about this as being something really, really important. So there are people who, they do their work and their programs, and then they sit down and look at these measures and try to figure out, like, how does this work or how does this not work? and how can we learn more about this, and how can, as you said, this is not for who our children right now. This is for generations and generations and generations beyond. And it's a beautiful thing to be a part of that. Miigwech.
Thank you both so much for all of your insight. And we appreciate you so much for joining us today and participating in our moderated panel. So I think with that, you all are free to hang out for the rest of the webinar while we wrap it up. Thank you.
Better.
All right. So we want to thank you all for joining us. And we do ask that you help us evaluate this webinar by responding to 2 poll questions that will pop up. Our first poll is asks you to please select the option that best represents your perspective on the following statement. As a whole, the webinar was a good use of my time. Your option choices are strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, and strongly disagree. And our second question is to please select the option that best represents your perspective on the following statement. My knowledge or skills have increased as a result of this session. And so your answer choices are strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, and strongly agree. And so while you type your answers to the poll, I wanted to thank you all again so much for joining us. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me, Diana Gates, at dgates@mathematica-mpr.org. If you have questions about the ECB Center, you can email Teresa Derrick Mills at tderrick-mills@urban.org.
The email address is tderrick-mills@urban.org.
Slides from this event, more events to come, and also previous events can be found on the Building Childcare Research Capacity webpage on the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluations website. So thank you all again. Once you voted in your poll, feel free to log out, and we appreciate you for joining us today.